Inside each and every one of us is the most marvellous and complicated object in the known universe, our brain. But have you ever stopped to wonder, why don't men ask for directions? Why are zombies scary? And can I trust my brain? Join us on a voyage of discovery into the vast landscape of your mind to answer the things you need to know about your brain. Starting with, do I only use 10% of my brain? Well, according to Aristotle, you don't really use it at all. He thought it was just a radiator for keeping us cool. But modern science now knows that even though it looks like a wobbly walnut, you use all of your brain all of the time. In fact, even though it's only 2% of your body mass, this machine devours nearly a quarter of your energy. To only use 10% of its capacity would be like buying a Sherman tank for the school run.
The idea that we only use 10% of our brains is complete nonsense. There's no way we could do all the different things that we do all the time if we only use 10% of our brains.
Our brains are huge and they're extremely complex and they're metabolically really expensive. They use an enormous amount of our energy, and that's happening for a reason. We're paying this cost for a reason because our brain's doing an enormous amount of work.
It's a complete myth. It's probably the biggest myth in all of science. It would be true to say that we use only a proportion of our brain at certain times during the day.
We've evolved to have these brains that are dangerously large, so large that they can kill women in childbirth. We need these brains for a reason. We're not going to get these big brains and then leave 90% of it redundant.
I did a first aid course about 15 years ago, and it was taught on the course that head injuries aren't serious because we only use 10% of our brains. And I was thinking, what? I mean, this is incredible. This was being said by somebody who was standing up and talking and knowing his name and breathing, all of that being made possible by his brain working extremely hard. It comes from self-help. It comes from the concept that you could be using your brain more. And that's great, that's a nice thing to believe, but it doesn't take away from your fact that your brain as a whole works extremely hard and you need all of it. You really don't want to be missing a bit of your brain.
Right now, your brain is powering 100 billion neurons. There's over 180,000 kilometres of this electric spaghetti at work in your brain. Enough to go around the world 4 times.
Even when you're doing absolutely nothing, your brain is working extremely hard. There's a whole set of brain areas dedicated to doing nothing, believe it or not, all down the midline. If you look in brain imaging experiments, it lights up when you've got subjects just resting, staring into space. And then a whole other set of brain areas around the outside light up when, for instance, they're using their visual senses, or when they're using their acoustic senses, when they're hearing. Whole other brain areas, if you get them to perform a manual task, this area will light up. If you get them to do something strategic, problem solving, perhaps inhibit the urge to do something, frontal brain areas will light up. So even the most simple activity like picking up a cup of tea uses your whole brain.
We can tell from putting people in fMRI scanners and asking them to do nothing that even when they think they're doing nothing, lots of bits of their brain are active, let alone when you're doing something. You know, if I clench my fists now and I'm talking, there is masses of activity going on all over my brain.
Even the simple act of drinking tea creates a lightning storm of activity. But first, you need to know what tea is. So your hippocampus calls up old memories of drinking tea. Then your visual cortex cleverly picks out the cup from the saucer, before your motor cortex lifts the cup to your mouth. And while these bits of your brain are enjoying a tea break, the rest of your brain is hard at work supporting these neurons.
There was a stat that we have 9 glial cells for every 1 neuron. So that's 9 support cells for every 1 brain cell that actually sends a message from A to B. Actually, a couple of years ago, someone looked into it in more detail. They found that we've got 85 billion neurons, plus or minus 10 billion, and 85 billion glial cells, again, plus or minus 10 billion. So we have a 1-to-1 ratio of support cells to message-sending cells. But the point is, if you didn't have the glial cells, then the neurons couldn't do their job properly.
The glial cells, the job they do in your brain is they look after the neurons. It's like the neurons are thoroughbreds and they need a whole team of people to look after them. And what they're doing is they're providing nourishment and maintenance to the neurons, and they're also physically holding them in place and tidying up any dead bits of tissue and any inflammation that's there. The glial cells are in charge of all that. And it's probably true to say that your neurons could not work properly if they didn't have the glial cells embedded around them.
So, there's an underlying army of cells that provide insulation, food, protection, and sweep up dead neurons. All in, you have about 1 trillion brain cells. In fact, there are more cells in your head than there are stars in the entire galaxy.
There have been some cases where people have had the most extraordinary brain injuries and still survived and still been able to function. So some people argued, oh, well, that must mean then that those bits of the brain were doing nothing and that there's all this space in the brain that we don't need. In fact, of course, what it shows is that other areas can sometimes take over and that the brain, really is amazing and will constantly change to try to cope with things.
How can I boost my brain? You can train your body, but is there a workout for your brain? Before you invest in the latest brain training games by Dr. Do Very Little, you might want to consider this recent research from the University of Cambridge. They took 8 scientists, 12 brain training games, and over 11,000 volunteers through a 6-week mental workout, and found no improvement to intelligence whatsoever.
There are all sorts of different ways that people have tried to increase their brain function because we'd all like to be a bit cleverer, particularly without trying too hard. You can try brain training, but it may just get you better at those particular tasks. It may not make you better at everything else, but the jury's out on how widespread a difference brain training can make.
The only way to change brain function, and you can improve your brain function, is to use your brain, to do the work with your brain. So everything that you can do, everything that you're an expert in, from walking to singing to reading, is something that you've trained your brain up to do. So your brain has changed as a result of this. And that's not something that has to end with childhood. There's lots of studies that have shown, for example, that learning to juggle in adulthood will change your brain.
There's a lovely idea that playing Mozart to your baby or to your child could make them cleverer without them putting in any effort at all. This is a really nice idea, but unfortunately, there isn't any evidence for it. It all comes from a paper that came out in 1993 that did an experiment that wasn't even on babies or children. It was done on students. And they played them Mozart, or they played them nothing at all, and they found that the ones who played Mozart for a while afterwards, but only for 15 minutes, did better on these sort of paper folding tasks, sort of origami tasks where you had to cut snips in a paper, work out how it would be when it was unfolded. And they did do better at those if they'd been listening to Mozart, but that only lasted for 15 minutes. That's very different from them being clever altogether. It's very different from babies being cleverer. And it's been shown that this can work with all sorts of music. It hasn't got to be Mozart. Basically, you can boost your brain power with certain sorts of tasks for about 15 minutes with the U2 effect, the blur effect, whatever you like. You can do it with music because music just basically energizes you a bit. There's nothing special about Mozart.
But there is one way to get maximum brain gain. Playing any musical instrument, even the drums. You see, your brain is a bit like plasticine. It's shaped and moulded by the things you do. Musicians have more connections between the two sides. They've got bigger cerebellums and up to 130% more grey matter. And that's because intense concentration and coordination physically improves the brain.
Learning to play a musical instrument basically involves activity throughout the entire brain, getting all different brain areas talking to each other.
Playing music can change your brain because there's this neuroplasticity. We form new brain connections when you do something like, say, learn to play the piano.
It's essentially the perfect workout for the brain.
But before you dust off that saxophone, there's something you should know. It takes about 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. And your plasticine brain starts to stiffen as you get older. But there is another way to boost your brain, and you don't have to start young. London cabbies are required to learn 25,000 streets within a 6-mile radius of Charing Cross. Some scientists got under their hoods with a brain scanner, and they found their memory centre was actually bigger. The hippocampus had grown to accommodate all that extra knowledge, but they still have trouble working out the correct change.
It's not the case that you emerge on Earth with a perfect and hardwired and fully functioning brain. All sorts of things can change it, all sorts of ways that you can train it can change your brain. For example, London taxi drivers who've done the knowledge have got larger bits of their brain called the hippocampus, which are very important in spatial memory. And that comes about through them doing the knowledge and working as taxi drivers. If you look at people who've successfully passed the knowledge and people who fail, you can actually see differences in the size of these brain areas. It's actually the training that's changing their brains.
Why don't men ask for directions? Navigation doesn't come easily to human brains, or indeed jellyfish who haven't got any. No, nature's great navigator is the Arctic tern. They clock up an incredible 44,000 air miles every year. Their tiny brains contain biomagnetite, which can sense the Earth's magnetic field, a bit like having a compass in your own head. Humans don't have that luxury. But we're not all slaves to sat-nav, not just yet. Some trends suggest that men and women have developed different ways of getting about, and it might be down to the way we use our brains. So, you're off on a trip, in a race to the airport. It's thought that women tend to use each brain hemisphere equally, making them better at language. They navigate using landmarks that can be described. Go past the big clock and turn left at the shoe shop.
It is very hard to get men to ask for directions. They do seem to see it as something of a weakness, as if somehow they should know the way somewhere they've never been. There's nothing wrong with not knowing where you're going if you've never been there. It's not stupid. But for some reason, they seem to think it is.
There's a considerable amount of research that suggests that men are good at visuospatial tasks like translating a 2D map into navigating a 3D environment. Conversely, women are much better at social interaction, and in particular, verbal fluency and verbal reasoning tasks.
The amazing thing about these navigational gender differences is that it's not just in humans, it's also in other mammals, such as monkeys, mice, rats and voles.
Modern imaging techniques show that men and women both have language strongly on one side of their brain. For most of us, it's on the left side of the brain.
However, research shows that men tend to use their right brains more. It's slightly bigger than the left and isn't really interested in talking, preferring instead to create a 3D model of the surroundings.
Men tend to be much better than women on visuospatial and navigation tasks, such as rotating 3D objects in your head, wayfinding on maze tasks, and also other mental rotation tasks.
Men think about places as points on a compass. They just want to head south. So, who's right? The female method would be more efficient. Using landmarks, you might get to your destination quicker and with fewer wrong turns. That is, until the sun goes down. Unable to see the landmarks, you've had it. Although, there is some doubt about this theory.
To be honest, it's pretty controversial. You can see these differences, but they tend to be trends, and sometimes we read more into those trends, maybe because we want there to be interesting differences and we want there to be evolutionary stories.
If you get a load of people to do some visuospatial tasks, then 75% of the people who do really, really well on them will be male. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some women who are really, really good at it as well.
It is interesting to bear in mind, for example, that a psychologist called Katie Alcock, who was working in Africa in a very, very barren environment in Tanzania, she reckoned that the children in Tanzania would have to be better at spatial tasks than children in the UK because they don't have landmarks to navigate by. There aren't landmarks to navigate by. And indeed, she found that those children had got better spatial working memory than children growing up in the UK.
So why don't men ask for directions? Because we're not lost, even when we are.
Winding the window down to ask for directions. It's like admitting defeat.
Why do I get travel sick? Your brain will do practically anything to keep your body alive. However, for a lot of life's problems, it's only got one answer. Food poisoning? Vomit. You're pregnant? Vomit. Even a bumpy road. You guessed it, Puke City.
Vomiting is your body's answer to quite a lot of problems. Bangs on the head, ingested poisons, vomiting is the answer. And it's your body trying to get rid of things that it thinks could be causing the problem, things that might be poisoning you.
The trouble is, your brain is sometimes wrong, and here's why. Buried deep inside your inner ear, you've got a motion detector. It's called the vestibular system, and it's basically 3 fluid-filled chambers full of microscopic hairs. When you move, the fluid sloshes about. It bends the hairs to let your brain know which way you're going.
The sense of balance is looked after by the vestibular system. It's a bunch of structures in the inner ear. So if anyone's had an inner ear infection, you know exactly what the inner ear does. It's to do with balance. It's to do with rocking motion, feeling like you're either moving forwards or backwards. There's another structure in the inner ear that gives you up-down information. So you can, when you're in an elevator and you feel yourself go up, it's that part of the brain involved. And then there's these 3 semicircular canals, and that allows you to figure out whether your head's moving this way, or this way. So the vestibular system is a little bit of an imprecise sense. The sense of balance doesn't get it totally right all the time. It needs to be mapped onto the visual sense, because we've got a massive chunk of the back of our brain, the occipital cortex, dedicated to visual processing. So when you map the balance information onto the visual information, then it all makes sense. As soon as you can't see what's going on and you lose that ability to map the balance information to the visual, your body thinks, oh my God, I might have been poisoned, and reflexively will cause you to feel nauseous and eventually vomit. It's basically a safety measure. It might not be that you've got a toxin in your body, but just in case, if that's the cause of all this wooziness and feeling wobbly, puking is the safest thing you can do.
So as you bounce along in the back of your car, the fluid in your inner ear is splashing about. But your eyes tell a different story. Seeing the inside of a car, they think your body is completely stationary. Your brain can't agree on what you feel and what you see, so it jumps to the only logical conclusion: you've been poisoned. Your brain heroically steps in to save the day. It tells your stomach to contract, forcing its contents back out.
Something that really seems to help with travel sickness is to be able to look at some fixed point like the horizon or something far in front of you. This seems to be why drivers don't get sick, because that's what they're doing when they drive.
A similar thing happens when you drink too much. Alcohol is a bit of a sly one. Its tiny molecules sneak into your inner ear. It's much lighter than water, thinning the fluid, causing it to become massively oversensitive. The result is the dreaded spins and more vomit.
Because your vestibular system is sitting next to the parts of your ears that are doing the job of hearing, things that can go wrong with hearing can also lead to problems with your vestibular system. So diseases like Meniere's disease, where you lose your hearing, can also be accompanied by awful, dreadful vertigo, where people have a terrible sensation of falling and dizziness, and they basically can't move. It's horrible.
Why can't I remember her name? So you're at the office party, and you've just met your dream girl. But there's a problem. You've already forgotten her name. And everyone else's. Don't worry, you're not losing your marbles, just your chance of a date.
When you meet someone for the first time, there is so much activity going on in the brain to do with governing that social interaction. It's all about, what am I going to say next? What are they going to think of me? The last thing you're thinking about is the person's name, so of course you forget it.
It's really, really common not to be able to remember people's names. I'm absolutely terrible at it. You meet someone new, and I'm far more interested in what they're wearing and what I think they're like than actually remembering their name, and then it's too late.
Making memories is tricky. Your neurons have to forge new connections. If you remembered everything you heard, you'd soon run out of brain space. So your mind deliberately makes it hard. First, you have to get through your working memory, which is constantly being rewritten because it can only hold about 7 things.
Things get into our memory by quite active processes. It's not like pressing record on a tape recorder and then sort of encoding some piece of information. We remember things that we understand, and one of the ways that we understand things is by giving them names, by labelling them, by fitting them into the world about which we know.
We actually forget most of what happens to us. If you ask people how many things they can remember they did in the previous fortnight, it's an average of only 6 to 9 things. I mean, that is nothing. Memory is not this perfect videotape. We reconstruct events in our mind as we try to remember them. We try to work them out and make sense of them.
That's why it's hard to remember anything longer than a phone number. But, if important, it gets stored in your long-term memory by your hippocampus. Usually, though, there's no logic to names, which makes them harder to keep hold of.
Names can be difficult because they can be so arbitrary, because there's not necessarily meaning to help you. So here's a John. Well, there's not necessarily anything Johnish about John. There can be lots of Johns. They won't necessarily have much in common with each other. So all you've got to go on is to remember the link itself. There's nothing else to help you.
One thing you can do to help remember names better is to deliberately repeat that person's name when they've said it. So they say, hello, I'm Sandra, and you say, hello, Sandra, really nice to meet you. And at least you've said it once, and that might underline it in your brain, and you might be more likely to remember it. The other thing you can do is if you can visualise their name in some way, then that helps you remember it. But the trouble is that not many people are called, you know, Carrot Table. If they were, it would be easy, but unfortunately, that's not their name.
So to help, you need to hold on tight to new names by repeating them to yourself over and over. But remembering Anne is only half the battle. Then you need to find her name again. And your brain is like a messy bedroom with memories scattered all over the place. However, there is a trick. You can create a memory palace. To do this, you link new names with the memories you've already got, like the objects around your home.
There are some really amazing memory tricks that can help you remember vast quantities of information so long as you put enough time into creating a multi-sensory, emotional scene within whatever memory trick you use.
People who are renowned for amazing tricks of memory, so those people who can work out from which cards that have been dealt in a game of blackjack in a casino, what cards are still left in that hand, they almost always use a mnemonic strategy. They use something to support their memory. They're not just holding it all there. And a very common strategy would be to use a visual strategy, so to have a specific set of visual information. For example, items that occur along a route, and then you associate the incoming information that you want to remember with different points along that route.
Back in ancient Roman and Greek times, people had to memorize poems. Poems that lasted 5 hours or more, word for word, or suffer an untimely demise. Now, we've recently borrowed back some of these tricks, such as the memory palace, which involves taking a place that you know really well and placing memories in your mind's eye at different places along the route. It could be, say, for instance, the place you work, or your home, or your primary school. And you imagine tracing a route through that environment, and you place multi-sensory emotional memories of the objects you're trying to remember all the way along, so that later you can pick up the breadcrumbs on your way back through that environment.
So, to remember Anne, give her a spray tan and mentally put her in the back of your van. By creating this rich visual imagery, your neurons make more connections and you might stand a chance of getting that date after all. Why are zombies scary? If you didn't fear things, you wouldn't live for very long. You'd forever be walking into oncoming traffic or picking fights with tigers. And evolution prefers the activities that keep you alive, like staying well away from the brain-hungry reanimated undead. But how does fear work?
If there's a sudden bang, even newborn babies will jump, and this is the startle reflex that they're born with. Fear is something that's so crucial to all of us.
So, if you hear an almighty crash, you'll jump. The sound goes straight to your amygdala, the emotional part of your brain. It's a bit trigger-happy and initiates your fear response without really knowing the score. This sends your brain into overdrive, releasing up to 30 different hormones that cause a physiological response. So your pupils dilate to let in more light. Your digestion grinds to a halt, and saliva production shuts down. Your mouth goes dry. Rapid breathing sends more oxygen into your bloodstream. Your heart beats faster and veins constrict, forcing blood and more energy into your arms and legs.
When we're really afraid, the fight or flight mechanism kicks in, and basically the body absolutely gets ready to run faster than you've ever run, if you're going to, or to fight stronger and harder than you've ever fought.
Being scared is an incredibly useful emotion. If you are any kind of animal going about your environment, it's really important that you recognise when things are threatening. And for mammals, the emotion of fear and the response of being scared is a very central element for that. That's how we are dealing with threatening situations, and it's how we respond to threatening situations.
Meanwhile, as the shuffling silhouette comes into focus, the pictures get beamed to your visual cortex. Your hippocampus flicks through your memory bank and finds all those old horror films. You correctly recognise the unidentified intruder as zombie.
The really scary thing about zombies is that they're a little bit too like us.
But we know deep down that they're fundamentally different.
They're revolting, but they are very human at the same time.
They're not really there. There's some absence of humanity behind the eyes. There's something missing.
So your amygdala was right. Finally, you're ready to fight for your life or to run like hell. But there's no rush. All this happened in just 1/5 of a second, and zombies are slow.
There's a theory called the uncanny valley, which is a term coined by a Japanese researcher in robotics called Professor Mori in the 70s.
Uncanny valley is a way of describing things that are very, very human-like, but somehow something's a little bit wrong. So you can see it in some CGI renderings of humans, like in the cinema, where they look realistic enough and they seem to move like humans, but their faces don't move quite right, and there's something just not sitting right to your eye.
The uncanny valley captures the idea that as a non-human entity becomes more like a human, we grow positive towards it. This occurs up until a specific tipping point, at which we quickly become repulsed towards these entities. In this valley of the graph, this is where zombies lie, and this is why we're scared of them.
Something like a robot you don't need to be scared of because you can't really relate to it. But zombies, scarily, could be people.
Why does ice cream make my head hurt? Sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia, to give it its scientific name, characterised by a sharp pain to the forehead while having an ice cream or very cold drink.
Headaches are associated with changes in the blood supply to the brain. You don't actually have nerve endings in the brain itself, so when you have a headache, the pain isn't coming from your brain.
But first things first, what is pain? Your average Egyptian thought it was caused by spirits getting in through his nostrils. So he sported a nose ring, not for fashion, but to ward off the evil apparitions. Science didn't catch up until 1906, when the first pain receptor was discovered. And it turns out there's an army of up to 80,000 of them beneath your skin. When disturbed, they send word to your cortex, which registers the source of the attack. It's your body's way of telling your brain that you're in danger.
Pain, believe it or not, is actually a good thing. For example, if you touch a scalding hot frying pan, a reflex will kick in that pulls your hand away before you even know what's happened. It's only afterwards that the damaged tissue sends a pain message up to the brain, which basically enables you to guard that body part.
People don't always respond to painful damage in the same way. There was a case in the US of a bank robber who had a prolonged shootout at the bank, tried to escape by hot wiring a car before dropping dead because 20 minutes earlier he'd been shot through the heart and hadn't registered this at all, the whole excitement of robbing a bank.
So what's so dangerous about tucking into a rum and fudge sundae? Well, when the cold stuff hits the roof of your mouth, the tiny blood vessels contract so rapidly, a small pain message is sent to your brain. But the message intersects with an 8-lane mega highway running from your forehead. By the time it's arrived at your cortex, your brain thinks it's come from all over your head. And that's where you feel the crippling pain.
Pain is a really interesting sensation because it's highly subjective. So you could be in the kitchen picking up a kettle and it's really, really hot. If it's empty, you'll drop it. If you're picking up a kettle that's full of boiling water and it's really, really hot, you will place it back down rather than drop it because hurling boiling water all over yourself would be worse.
So how best to deal with pain? Scientists think swearing might be the answer. When given permission to shout a 4-letter word of your choice, you can withstand pain for up to twice as long. But the people around you might prefer it if you just took a couple of aspirin instead.
When you do something really, really painful, like stub your toe, it's very, very common to swear an awful lot. And actually, it turns out this could be just the right thing to do to try to reduce that pain. So they did an experiment where they got people to keep their arm in a bucket of ice water for as long as possible. And that sounds really easy, but believe me, after a really short time, that pain comes up your arm and it is absolute agony. And you just think, I can't keep it there any longer. They got some people to swear with a word of their choice. They could choose what it was, and they just had to repeat this swear word again and again and again while holding their arm in the bucket of water. And they actually managed to hold their arm there for 40 seconds longer, which is a long time, for 40 seconds longer than the people who were just saying a neutral word. So it just goes to show that swearing is useful, but the only trouble is it wears off. So if you do it all the time, it's not going to work as effectively, because what it seems to do is to actually be emotional and speed up the heart rate, and that seems to help with the pain.
Why do we fall in love? Plato thought he knew a thing or two about love. Oh, yeah. He reckoned that men and women were originally joined together. A super being with 4 arms and 2 heads. We tried to overthrow the gods, but they didn't take kindly to that sort of thing. So Zeus split us in 2, and we've been trying to get back together ever since. A nice story, perhaps, but the truth is far more powerful.
The neuroscience of love is absolutely fascinating. Basically, it boils down to 3 different systems in the human brain, each of which are responsible for a different function.
In evolutionary terms, I think what we call love is the thing that lets social primates like us have the kind of long-term close relationships that mean that we have children with people we're in relationships with, that we care for those children, that we care for the older adults in our group.
Brain imaging experiments have taken people who are madly in love and looked at which brain areas light up when they look at an image of their loved one. And the interesting thing is, exactly the same parts of the reward system light up when they see the person they love as light up when a drug addict takes the drug of choice. So when they feel exhilarated and high on that addictive drug, it's the same brain area that does love.
Cupid's arrow comes dipped in a heady cocktail of brain chemicals. They are literally addictive, like cocaine. And they work in 3 different stages throughout the course of your life. Amongst the first are dopamine and testosterone. They give you that racing heart, sleeplessness, and the butterflies in your stomach when you meet someone you fancy. But that's just a warm-up act. Lust.
Lust is governed by testosterone in both men and women. It means you copulate more frequently if you have high levels of testosterone, and if you've got low levels of testosterone, then your libido isn't very strong, you're not interested in sex. So the treatment is always to give people a testosterone supplement, and then that can raise their libido.
There's a lovely experiment from the 1970s called Love on a Bridge, and they got this pretty female researcher to stand on a very, very high suspension bridge in Vancouver. And it's one of those bridges that swings about and is really scary. And she stopped young men coming across the bridge and got them to do an experiment. Then she gave them her card in case they wanted to get the results from her. She repeated the same experiment downstream on a big, wide, boring, old, dull concrete bridge that wasn't scary at all. And loads more of the men from the scary bridge phoned her up. The theory is that because they were on the bridge, their heart started racing, they started having these physical symptoms, and they actually then misinterpreted those and thought it must be that they liked the woman.
The second stage of love pushes you head over heels into romantic love. And enter the real star of the love parade, oxytocin. This is released when you have sex and creates that special bond. It's the superglue that holds you together.
If you look at the brain chemically, in the early stages of love, the absolute head over heels area of it, it's interesting that the levels of serotonin, which makes people feel happy, are actually low, which is surprising and is what you would see in somebody with an obsessive compulsive disorder. So in fact, the early stages of love might actually be more like an obsession in terms of what's happening in your brain.
But around 3 years after your first date, dopamine production slows down and the romantic gestures die off. The third and final stage of your relationship depends on endorphins to keep you together. These are your natural painkillers and give you that sense of well-being and security, potentially for the rest of your life.
I think love is a bit of a trick in that love buys you bonding with other humans, and that sort of bonding that lets you have a long enough term relationship that you have offspring. It lets you treat those offspring well. You don't eat them, you know, because you love them.
Attachment evolved so that man and woman would stay together for long enough beyond the love phase to actually raise the child so that it's ready to fly the nest and lead a life of its own.
Love can actually be good for you physically as well as being really nice. They did one experiment where they made blisters on brave volunteers' arms, and then they got them to discuss things with their partner and to see how fast the blisters healed. And the blisters actually healed faster in the people where they had a nice, loving conversation with their partners because they were very much in love.
Can I trust my brain? Do you see strange things in the corner of your eye? Or mistake one thing for another? Do not adjust your brain. There is a problem with reality.
Our memories are so unreliable that it's actually not that hard to induce completely false memories in people. In one experiment, they got people to absolutely believe that when they were young, they met Bugs Bunny when they went to Disneyland. Now, there's only one problem with that. Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers character, so he's never going to get into Disneyland. So they definitely didn't do it. In another experiment, they even got people to believe that when they were younger, they had kissed a big, bright green plastic frog. They hadn't.
You can't necessarily trust your brain because although the things that you see and the things that you hear can feel real, actually the majority of that is your brain filling in all kinds of details all the time because you don't see that much and you don't hear that much.
There's just too much information out there, and your brain can't take it all in. If it did, your head would be so big your neck couldn't support your expanding cranium. So to make sense of the world, your brain takes a few shortcuts, and sometimes it gets it wrong. For starters, only 1% of what you see is actually in focus. Everything else is a blur.
The brain has a limited capacity, which means that we can't take in everything that we encounter in a day, such as all the people, places and things that we come across. It means that we don't always take in our full world, but we have to cut corners some of the time.
Our brains are really clever because what they do is they take in everything that's coming in from our senses. They take in what we see, what we think we see, what we think we hear, and they do create a picture of the world that most of the time works quite well. It doesn't always work, which is why you can trick it quite easily with, say, optical illusions.
Your brain only takes in that small area when you're looking at things because that's where the really detailed information is in your eye. And so the point at which you're actually looking at things, focusing on things, is where the most information is being gleaned. And you can deal with that spot being the only useful spot because you also move your eyes. So you're actually continuously filling in all the spots around you.
In fact, your eyes are constantly on the move, so your brain takes snapshots, 3 per second, to build a composite picture piece by piece. It can't capture everything, so it fills in the blanks with memories and guesswork. Test it out. Take a look at this flashing image. Your brain is only taking in the important bits of this scene, so things get missed. Did you notice the change? It's called change blindness, and it proves that you can't take in everything all of the time. So if your eyes are constantly on the move, how come the world isn't one big blur? Well, your brain cleverly turns your eyes off every time they move, leaving you in the dark for 200 milliseconds at a time, which adds up for about 2 hours a day you are blind.
There is masses and masses of information from the outside world coming into our brains all the time. And we don't actually just see everything as it is and hear everything as it is. Our brains make sense of it for us, and they give us a picture of the world and an image of the world that is enough, but it's not exactly accurate.
The brain will actually see and hear what it wants to see and hear, and it's always looking out for things like faces and voices. Consequently, it's really easy to think you can see a face in a cloud or think you can hear the devil talking to you on a record played backwards. It's your brain filling in.
Does grey matter? There's a very simple way to figure out how important certain brain bits are. Take a piece out and see what happens. You'll quickly discover which sections make you happy. Or remember where you live. And the bits that know the difference between your dad and a daisy. But removing perfectly good brain parts to see what happens isn't cool. However, that sometimes happened by accident.
The human brain is an incredibly complex, densely interconnected, woven ball of millions and millions of brain cells. Now, it's constantly sending millions of messages from A to B every second, and we didn't really know that much about how it works until, as recently as 10, 20, 50 years ago.
Nowadays, we use brain scanners to understand how the human brain works. But up until 20 years ago, the only real way we could find out more about what the human brain did was by working with patients who'd had some sort of damage to their brain, nature's accidents, if you like.
There have been some cases where people have had the most extraordinary brain injuries and still survived and still been able to function. So some people argued, oh, well, that must mean then that those bits of the brain were doing nothing and that there's all this space in the brain that we don't need. In fact, of course, what it shows is that other areas can sometimes take over and that the brain, really is amazing and will constantly change to try to cope with things.
In 1953, one of those accidents left a man unable to make any new memories. But on the upside, this allowed us to identify the hippocampus as the bookkeeper to our memory banks. But perhaps the strangest story is that of Phineas Gage.
The story of Phineas Gage has become really important within neuroscience, and in textbooks in psychology and neurology, one of the first stories you ever read is about poor old Phineas Gage.
In 1848, in the USA, demolition man Phineas was blasting his way through solid rock, making way for a new railroad, ramming gunpowder into a hole with an iron bar. Health and safety hadn't really taken off yet. Unsurprisingly, the gunpowder went off, sending the bar straight through his face. It landed 30 meters away, having removed his frontal lobe and his inhibitions.
At the time, there was a huge argument going on about whether every bit of the brain did something different, or whether if one part was broken, if you like, other parts could take over. Both sides said that this proved their case, because he did survive, but he was changed.
He's been used to sort of tell different stories in that time. So when I was an undergraduate, the story of Phineas Gage was how important your brain was to your personality, how much your personality could change after damage to the brain.
The prefrontal lobe is this area behind your forehead, and this is an area that people very much use to control their inhibitions. And so we don't go around saying absolutely what we'd like to say about everyone all the time. But people who've had damage in this area, sometimes you'll see this after a stroke, will say anything to anyone and quite often cause offence, but they really, really don't mean to.
Amazingly, he survived, but with dramatic consequences. He went from being a nice guy to short-tempered and rude. He even lost his job.
If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have known what this prefrontal cortex does. The man goes from being incredibly disciplined, reliable individual to, totally socially inept, having a conversation, starting to urinate in front of people. He was absolutely unable to control his impulsive behaviour.
So Phineas's personality switch proved, for the first time ever, that your grey matter defines who you are.